if Britain and America can shoot down Iranian missiles over Israel, why on earth can't we do the same over Ukraine?
Only force works as an argument for Russia.
The Putin regime is a regime effectively defined by war.
Do you think it is actually interested in ending the war?
No, I don't. Russia will go on. Putin will continue.
The UK government is secretly preparing for a possible direct attack by Russia.
Absolutely, UK and all NATO countries should be preparing for such an eventuality.
General Shirreff, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me, and it's very, very good to be talking to you again.
Thank you. These days it is quite hard to raise a topic in an interview that will still feel relevant a few days later. I would start with a general question. How do you assess US President Trump's efforts to help resolve the Russian-Ukrainian war? We recently passed the 100-day mark of the new US administration. Do any of these efforts seem hopeful to you?
Everybody wants to see an end to this war. And that is about as far as I can say. But the way Trump has been doing it shows a failure to understand the reality of Russia as a state, a failure to understand Ukraine's position. And it seems to me that the efforts he has been making have been all about Putin and effectively giving Putin what he wants to achieve, rather than thinking through the full implications of effectively empowering a blood-stained autocrat to continue a war of genocidal aggression against Ukraine.
Why, in your opinion, it is happening like this? Why Trump is giving Putin what he wants to?
Well, I don't know what's gone on between Putin and Trump. And I don't understand the dynamic. All I can say is that when I read the terms of the Trump proposed ceasefire, it was all about Putin and not about recognizing the sovereignty of a free and independent Ukraine and the land that has been occupied. I can't speculate about the relationship between Putin and Trump. All I can say is that the implication of giving Putin what he wants, not only for Ukrainian security, but also for wider European security, are really, really dangerous.
Here in Ukraine, after 11 years of war, we've learned that Russia only understands force. And you've mentioned multiple times in your interviews that only force works as an argument for Russia. Why do you think President Trump and new US administration has chosen different approach? Because at least on the public level, at least publicly, in this 100 days, we've seen pressure mainly on Ukraine, not Russia.
I think the very best can be said is that it is naive. But it's worse than that. It's naive stupidity, and it's naive stupidity without any understanding of history, any understanding of the nature of Russia, any understanding that Russia is determined to rebuild another empire, determined to remove Ukraine from the map as a sovereign state. And that's not okay. And it's not okay to sanction an autocrat and a dictator, to invade another country, to level its cities, to massacre its civilian population, and inflict appalling atrocities on women and other civilians. And everything that Trump has been doing has been playing to that without really understanding the reality of it all. And I think it's up to all of us who speak on these matters to lay out very clearly what Russia is trying to achieve. And as you say, the only language Russia understands is force. And the only way there will be a lasting peace in Ukraine, in my view, is if Russia is defeated in Ukraine. And that means that the West, that NATO, including America, should be adopting and designing a strategy to support Ukraine to achieve victory in Russia, in Ukraine over Russia. And until that happens, I'm afraid I think that there can be no lasting peace.
We will talk about this strategy as well soon. I just want to make a small note for our audience that we are recording this interview on the 6th of May, and it will be published after the May 9th celebration in Moscow, and we heard Vladimir Putin announced a short ceasefire for the 9th of May. He also recently announced a ceasefire for Easter. This is the first time during these 3 years of full-scale invasion when he has done that. How do you understand these actions?
I think this is all about Putin. It's all about Russia seeking advantage. I mean, the proposed ceasefire that Putin's announced for the Victory Day parade on the 9th of May is so that that it doesn't rain on his parade. He doesn't want his parade spoilt. And it's up to Ukraine and Ukrainian defense planners. But I think the rest of the world would love to see a major attack on Moscow right to coincide with the parade. That would absolutely send a message to Russia. As for the other ceasefire, more recently over Easter, I think that's about Russia seeking advantage and trying to redeploy, to recover, to get itself into another position from which it can launch further attacks against Ukraine, either on the land borders or from the skies.
But an interesting moment is that Vladimir Putin refused to agree for this longer ceasefire that the US and Ukraine offered earlier. Where is the logic?
There isn't a logic. It's all about Russian advantage. And he didn't agree to that ceasefire because it didn't suit Russia, and it wasn't to Russia's advantage because he believed that he wanted to continue the fight against Ukraine, particularly, of course, in the Kursk salient, where he was desperate to try and reclaim and regain as much land as he possibly could.
Well, and he was successful in this. By the way, how do you assess what was going on in this Kursk region between the Russian and Ukrainian forces during the last weeks? Because unfortunately for Ukraine, Ukraine couldn't keep this territory to make it some kind of a bargain in negotiations.
And Ukraine wasn't able to do that because the West did not double down on its military support. And I'm afraid this comes back to the discussion we had earlier about the need for a strategy, a combined strategy from NATO, from the West, to give Ukraine the necessary support to achieve effective defeat of Russia in Ukraine. And without that, Ukraine will it will be a continued incremental effort without a really concentrated effect. And that is, I think, the key requirement.
When you look at Russia's capabilities as a retired general with an extensive experience, do you think it is actually interested in ending the war?
No, I don't. I don't think it is interested because Russia will go on. And Putin will continue. The Putin regime is a regime effectively defined by war from the earliest stages when he was acting president and serving as prime minister. We'll all remember the apartment bombings, which could well have been initiated by the FSB in order to give a pretext for what became the Second Chechen War. We saw the war, the war against Georgia in 2008. We saw the Russian engagement in the Syrian war. Then, of course, we saw the war in Ukraine start in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the secession and the separatist movements in Donetsk and Luhansk, which were absolutely engineered by Russia. So here is a regime that is defined by war, that feeds on war, and that it depends for war on its survival. And Russia will continue the war against Ukraine. Remember that here is the man who said the most appropriate security settlement for Europe is a new Yalta. So once he's achieved his aims in Ukraine, he will undoubtedly move on into Eastern Europe, for example, the Baltic states, Eastern Poland. He's already engineering electoral manipulation in Romania, for example, as he has done in Moldova and Georgia. So I don't think the war will stop until it is stopped, until Putin is forced to stop. So I come back to my point. The only way there will be lasting peace is if Ukraine is properly supported to achieve the defeat of Russia. Ukraine becomes a part of NATO, and there is the NATO alliance puts together a massive deterrent effect right across Eastern Europe, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, to ensure that Russia recognizes it will never achieve its aims because we are too strong for it.
Just to sum up, the question of the relations between the United States and Ukraine and its support to Ukraine, again, it is very difficult to discuss Trump's statements because one day he's saying that he might leave the talks with Ukraine and with Russia, and the next day the US and Ukraine sign a mineral deal and Trump's rhetoric towards Ukraine becomes softer. How do you see this? Do you think that US support to Ukraine will continue or not?
I don't know, but I am cautiously optimistic. I think President Zelensky has been quite clever with the latest mineral deal. Because what he has done is, by playing on Trump's vanity and hubris and greed, he, I think, has now got America on the hook with the promise of advantage to be gained from sharing Ukrainian minerals. Now, I think on the face of it, this is an appalling approach because this is exploiting Ukraine when Ukraine is in its hour of need instead of helping Ukraine. But Trump is Trump, and that's the nature of this man, the nature of the beast. What have we got? What has Ukraine got? It's got language from America, from Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, about Ukraine free, sovereign, independent. That's a start. It's got a recognition that this was the Russian invasion, an unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's a change. It's got the first tranche of military aid, some $50 million worth of military aid agreed by the Trump administration. That's a start. On the less positive side, on the downside, there are no security guarantees. And yes, absolutely, Trump and America could walk away from this deal. But I think we have to, in a sense, focus on what are the positives here. So I am cautiously optimistic that America will not walk away from Ukraine, as I think could have been the case before this deal was signed. So let's look on the bright side, even if it is slightly clutching at straws.
By the way, if we take a look what U.S. Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent said just recently, he said that a mineral deal will be a tacit security guarantee because of the economic partnership. So do you think we can say that the fact that this deal was agreed, the fact that it was signed, can it be considered like some kind of security guarantees?
No. To me, the only guarantee that matters is NATO airplanes in the skies above Ukraine and NATO troops supporting Ukraine to stop a Russian breaking of a ceasefire. That is the only way that there will be there can be any security guarantees. And ultimately, it has got to be a NATO Article 5 security guarantee. That is the only one that matters, because I don't need to say this to you in Ukraine. We all remember the Budapest Memorandum, and look where that got us. Absolutely nowhere. And I think the idea of American technicians, miners, mining companies operating in Ukraine as a security guarantee, frankly, is laughable. It's utterly meaningless, because they'll just walk away if there's a Russian, if and when there is a Russian attack. The only way you guarantee security against Russia is to have a bigger stick with which to hit Russia than they can hit you.
Let's talk a little bit about the strategy you mentioned, which is needed to conquer Russia. What are the parts of the strategy when you say that Europe and the West in general, maybe some other countries, that they need a strategy? What are the parts of it?
Well, it starts with defining the goal to be achieved. And to me, the goal to be achieved is a Europe whole, free and secure against a Russia an aggressive, revanchist Russia determined to build another Russian empire. And by a Europe whole, free and secure, I mean a Europe that very firmly includes Ukraine. There will be a number of objectives before that goal can be achieved. The first objective is defeat of Russia in Ukraine. And I say defeat of Russia in Ukraine rather than conquer Russia, because this isn't about marching on Moscow or taking the fight to Russia. It is about defeating Russian troops in Ukraine so that every Russian commander and Putin himself understands 100% that they can never achieve their aims in Ukraine. How is that to be achieved? Well, it's going to be achieved by identifying precisely what are the gaps in Ukrainian capability that need to be filled by the West. What are the ammunition requirements, the equipment requirements, the investment in defense requirements? Ukraine has a very successful defense industry. Ukraine can turn around weapons procurement infinitely more quickly than countries in Western Europe can. So we should be empowering Ukraine to achieve that. It may need Ukraine may need support with reform of its armed forces, organization of its armed forces. It may need support with training, particularly training at the higher level, command and control. So there will be a whole range of things. It may need one aspect of this strategy, absolutely, is economic. How can the West hit Russia really hard to undermine the Russian economy? How can it reduce the price of oil globally? Because reducing the oil price will have a major impact on the Russian economy. What about sanctions? What needs to be done to sanctions to ramp them up, to tighten them, to make them even more swinging than they are at the moment? So there are no let-outs and no ways by which nations can bypass sanctions. What about imports of Russian oil? What is being done about that? Still, Russian oil is flowing into Western Europe. So the strategy requires military, organization, economics, and a whole range of areas in order to achieve the desired effect. But it has to be brought together in a coherent, logical way to achieve the desired end state.
This week, the EU Commissioner for Defense, Andrius Kubilius, said the following, I will quote, "If Putin isn't convinced by Trump to make peace, we could bring forward more convincing arguments for peace very quickly by greatly increasing our military support to Ukraine." So it seems that the European Union, let us say, they are waiting to see how US support for Ukraine develops. Isn't Europe losing time? I mean, that these efforts to increase military support should already be happening?
Absolutely. Absolutely right, Olena. Europe has got to wake up. And it has been very clear from the Munich Security Conference in February that America is not with Europe, that Europe cannot rely on America, and that America cannot be trusted as an ally. Hegseth, the US Secretary for Defense, said it clearly himself. America is not going to come to the aid of NATO, of Europe anymore, or to underwrite European security. So it is now up to Europe to get on and sort itself out and to recognize that Europe has to stand on its own feet. Europe has 12 times the combined GDP of Russia, 4 times the population of Russia. It is not beyond Europe to say, if we can't rely on America, we'll do it ourselves. But that requires leadership, it requires sacrifice, it requires commitment and determination, and it requires explaining to European populations that this war in Ukraine is not just Ukraine's war. This is a war against Europe, it's a war against NATO as well, and that we have to take the necessary steps to achieve an end to this war.
A lot of attention has been given to the idea of sending European troops to Ukraine in future, but that depends, as far as I understand, directly on this long-term ceasefire. And that doesn't seem likely to happen soon. Should we talk about this idea at all now? I mean, should for example, Ukrainian diplomats, Ukrainian leadership, as well as European leadership, invest time and resource into discussing this prospect?
The requirement, if my strategy comes to pass, there will absolutely be a need for European troops on the ground in Ukraine once Ukraine has defeated Russia and once Russia recognizes it can go no further. But the idea of putting a small European force on the ground in Ukraine until and unless Russia has been defeated seems to me counterproductive or impossible, because the only way a European force can get on the ground in Ukraine is if it is prepared to fight. And anything else is just, it's a waste of time. What is not a waste of time, and I think something that could be pursued and should be pursued now, is the Sky Shield, concept of implementing and putting in place an integrated air protection zone in the skies above central and western Ukraine to shoot down Russian drones and, if possible, shoot down missiles as well. And that could be done right now if Europe had the political will to make it happen. And it would not be too high risk for Europe. So that is something that can be done now. But the notion of a force on the ground, and a European force on the ground, unless it is really strong enough and configured for full-scale warfighting and has the necessary size and mass to counter Russia, I think is simply not a starter until there is a ceasefire.
If to develop this idea of the Sky Shield, I remember that when the full-scale invasion started back in 2022, Ukraine raised this issue. So many Ukrainians, even in social media, they wrote in English that we need to close the sky over Ukraine, please, because we don't have enough air defense systems. Now you're saying that this is an idea that should be considered, but how is that possible if Europe and other Western partners of Ukraine, they exclude any chance to participate in this war? So how could it technically and politically maybe as well be organized to set this Sky Shield and to protect at least a part of Ukraine?
I think you're absolutely right to highlight this. What people were calling for in February 2022, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion, was a no-fly zone. I think the Sky Shield is different from a no-fly zone, because a no-fly zone would have meant NATO aircraft shooting down Russian aircraft over Ukraine. And that is why NATO countries stopped short, because they said, we cannot do this because it would mean war. It would mean that NATO is at war with Russia. Sky Shield is different. First point is that Russia has not launched aircraft over Ukraine really since the end of 2022. What it has done is launched, as you know better than anybody, missiles, drones on a nightly basis over Ukraine. Sky Shield would see European air forces providing planes based outside Ukraine to fly, to provide the means over Ukraine to shoot down missiles and drones in central and western Ukraine. It is very, very unlikely to bring them into direct confrontation with Russian aircraft. It would absolutely bring them in confrontation with Russian missiles and drones. But I think that is an acceptable risk. And I think it is exactly the sort of thing that Europe should be doing to send a message of strength to Putin and a message of solidarity to Ukraine. After all, my argument would be, if Britain and America can shoot down Iranian missiles over Israel, why on earth can't we do the same over Ukraine? In fact, it's much more important, in my view, to do it over Ukraine, because this is our war as well as Ukraine's war, and we should be doing all we can to support Ukraine.
So if we speak like more about technical side, you mean that it may be, for example, some European aircrafts and maybe air defense systems that will be established around Ukraine, not on the territory of Ukraine, yes, and they may be activated to shoot down some missiles, Russian missiles and drones.
Absolutely. So they could do this from outside Ukraine and provide a very effective and integrated air protection zone over central and western Ukraine. I think you'd have to say no over the eastern Ukraine because the risk becomes too high for European aircraft engaged there, and you've got into the whole issue of command and control in the deep fight war zone. But certainly over cities like Kiev and others in the center and west, it would be entirely possible.
But it looks like that the chance for this is even less than for gathering and deploying European troops to Ukraine. I mean, we saw how difficult this issue was developing. I mean, how many countries agreed and how many military personnel they, at least they think that they may include in this operation. And this sounds even more fantastic.
I fear you're right, Elena. But we should continue to say these things. And I mean, and what you say just highlights how utterly, I don't know, it's pathetic. It's absolutely pathetic that Europe is facing these challenges, is facing the threats. And what we're getting is endless platitudes from European leaders about we will stay with Ukraine for 100 years and we cannot allow Russia to defeat Ukraine or Russia to win in Ukraine, and all sorts of platitudes and slogans. But these now need to translate into real action. And I despair of the fact that they're not. And all I can say is that people like me will go on shouting from the rooftops about the need to step up as much as we can.
You mentioned about the threat that Russia potentially poses to other countries, not only Ukraine, for example, Eastern NATO countries like Baltic states. Just before our interview, the British newspaper The Telegraph reported that the UK government is secretly preparing for a possible direct attack by Russia. Do you believe in such a scenario, that it is likely that Russia will attack such country as the United Kingdom, for example?
No, likely, it depends. But absolutely, UK and all NATO countries should be preparing for such an eventuality. Only if NATO countries are prepared for the worst case, which means a direct attack by Russia on their countries, and the outbreak of war between Russia and a wider NATO. Only if we're prepared against such an attack can we effectively deter such an attack. So to me, this is essential that Britain should be doing this, as should every other NATO country doing it, because it's all about building resilience. If Europe, if NATO is seen as a soft target, going back to our discussions about Russia and understanding strength, then Russia will seek an advantage. Where it finds weakness, it drills away and exploits that weakness. Where it meets strength, it backs off. And that is one of the enduring lessons of European history. So it's absolutely right that the British government, if this report is accurate, should be doing just this.
But I also remember an argument that some European politicians, some European analysts applied to when we were earlier discussing such questions, that if it is possible that Russia will attack any NATO country, these people, they are saying that, look, Russia didn't manage to conquer Ukraine. So the war, it's been like 11 years already, and the 3 years of the full-scale invasion. So it just has no capabilities to try to attack any NATO country. Do you agree with these people?
I think Russia right now is fixed in Ukraine. But if there is, and it comes back to the discussion about the ceasefire, because if Russia and Putin get the sort of ceasefire that Trump was trying to push down Ukraine's throat, that will lead to Russia declaring victory. It will allow Putin to rebuild and reestablish and regenerate his armed forces. until he's ready to have another go at either finishing the job in Ukraine or extending the war further afield. And if he sees that NATO has been effectively neutralized by American withdrawal from NATO, he will seek advantage. And he could easily seek advantage by mounting an attack on the Baltic states. So absolutely, there is a long-term direct threat from Russia. And the way to deter that is through the sort of preparations that you just outlined.
Given the fact that European countries are becoming increasingly concerned about their own security, is there a risk that they might scale back their support for Ukraine in order to focus more on their own needs?
That's a good question, and there obviously is a risk. But I think we need to state very clearly that the threat against Europe posed by Russia in Ukraine and posed by Russia potentially succeeding in its aims in Ukraine will only increase the threat to European countries. So this needs to be a twin track. Number one, it's about continuing and ramping up support for Ukraine. Number two, it's about ramping up our own military capabilities.
General, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Elena. I hope it's helpful, but wish you luck.